Wow. Um, Today's deep dive is going to be interesting. We've got some pretty heavy stuff to unpack.
Yeah, it looks like we're going deep into censorship.
Yeah, you've given us the Taliban destroying those ancient Buddhist statues, and then we jump over to protests in Tiananmen Square.
And don't forget that fatwa against Salman Rushdie.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
And to top it off, you've even included this academic paper by Aurelie Hagstrom, The Catholic Church and Censorship in Literature, Books, Drama, and Film.
definitely a lot to dig into.
For sure.
Yeah.
These examples, they definitely make you think.
Yeah, they really highlight the power of censorship, just
They
the
do.
idea of it.
Right. And for a lot of people, I think any restriction on information or, even just expression feels wrong.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But before we jump into whether ALL censorship is, inherently bad, maybe we should start by defining what exactly we're talking about here.
Right. Censorship, it feels like one of those words that gets thrown around a lot. But what does it really mean?
Well, at its core, censorship is basically when those in power, whether it's a government religious institution or even, just a social group, restrict access to certain materials,
Materials.
like intellectual things, literary stuff or artistic stuff. It's about controlling the narrative, you know?
So is it kind of like those movie ratings that tell us what we can and can't watch? Or like how social media platforms have all those community guidelines?
Exactly. Those are good examples. And actually, Hagstrom's paper gives us a fascinating historical example with the Roman censor. You know those guys?
Vaguely, I always picture them like those stern-looking guys in togas.
Right. You might be surprised to learn they actually started out as glorified bean counters.
Wait, really?
Yep.
So how do they go from like taking a census to censoring art and literature?
It's a story of power creep, really.
Hmm.
So back in 443 BC, their main job was literally to count citizens for like tax and military purposes. But as time went on, their role kind of evolved, and they ended up with the authority to actually judge people's morals. They could even bar someone from public life if they didn't meet Rome's standards.
Wow, so it was like a social credit score situation, but in ancient Rome.
Kinda, yeah. It's a reminder that censorship, it's not just a modern thing. It's been around for centuries, and it's not limited to one culture either.
Right. Hagstrom mentions the trial and execution of Socrates in ancient Greece.
Exactly. Even in a society that supposedly prized free speech and all this philosophical debate, there were still limits. Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods, which ultimately led to his death sentence in 399 BC.
It makes you think about why those in power, even way back then, felt the need to control what people could read, hear, or even think.
For sure. It all comes down to power and control.
Which brings us to the heart of Hagstrom's paper, the Catholic Church and its, complicated relationship with censorship.
Yeah, she makes a distinction between what she calls in-house censorship and outward-facing censorship. Basically, actions taken within the church community itself versus those directed at the wider world.
So kind of like having family rules versus, trying to set rules for the whole neighborhood.
Exactly. And for in-house censorship, think of it like setting boundaries on, what's considered acceptable behavior or belief within a specific group.
Okay, so what would be an example of that within the church?
Well, the book of Acts describes Paul advocating for the burning of what they called superstitious books in Ephesus. These were probably books on magic and the occult, which early Christians saw as incompatible with their faith.
So it's like they were trying to protect the community, especially those who might be more easily swayed by like harmful or misleading ideas.
Yeah, and that connects to the idea of protecting the little ones that comes up in the Gospels. Remember that.
Yeah. Matthew's gospel talks about protecting those who are easily scandalized.
Right, and this could refer to children, new converts, or even just anyone whose faith might be shaken by certain ideas. This concept of protecting the vulnerable has been a big factor in a lot of the church's approaches to censorship throughout history.
So that makes sense for the in-house part. But what about that outward-facing censorship? What kinds of things did the church try to censor in the broader world?
Well, that's where we get to the infamous Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or as it's better known, the Index of Forbidden Books.
The Index of Forbidden Books?
Yeah.
I've heard of that. It sounds pretty intense.
It was a list of books that Catholics were strictly forbidden to read or own. And it wasn't just a few obscure titles either. We're talking about works by some of the greatest thinkers of the time.
Really? Like who?
Well, the list included works by Galileo Copernicus, Machiavelli, even John Milton.
Wow. For someone living today, that sounds crazy. Imagine being told what books you couldn't read. What was the church's reasoning behind such a drastic measure?
It all goes back to that idea of protecting the little ones from potentially, harmful or dangerous ideas. The church believed that certain texts posed a real threat to faith and morals, and they saw it as their duty to shield believers from those influences.
So they were basically saying, we know better than you what's good for you.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And you have to remember, this was a time of major religious upheaval. The Protestant Reformation was in full swing, and the church felt very much under attack. They saw the printing press as this incredibly powerful tool that could be used to spread both truth and falsehood. And they felt a need to, control the narrative.
So it's kind of like how some countries today try to control access to the internet.
Exactly. They're trying to prevent the spread of what they consider dangerous information. It's fascinating how those concerns about the power of ideas and the need to protect people from, harmful content have echoed through history.
It's a constant struggle, it seems. But didn't the church censor more than just books?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Their influence went way beyond literature. Think about those fig leaves strategically placed over new figures in Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel.
Oh, yeah. So even art wasn't immune to censorship.
Not at all. And it wasn't just Europe either. The American Catholic Church had a huge influence on Hollywood for a long time, especially in the early to mid-20th century. They had this group called the Legion of Decency.
The Legion of Decency? That sounds kind of ominous.
Well, they basically acted as a watchdog for the church, reviewing films and putting pressure on filmmakers to remove scenes they deemed offensive. It was a major factor in shaping what Americans could see on the silver screen.
Wow, so the church's reach was pretty far and wide.
Yeah.
It seems like they were actively trying to shape the moral landscape of society. It makes you wonder how this approach to censorship lasted for so long.
Well, it did for a while, but things started to change dramatically in the 1960s with the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II as it's often called. It brought about a major shift in the church's attitude towards the modern world and how they engaged with culture.
Vatican II. Yeah, that was a big turning point for the church, from what I understand. So how did it change the way they thought about censorship?
It was a pretty radical shift. Before Vatican II, the church's stance was very much one of church versus world. It was all about defending their teachings and traditions against what they saw as, outside threats. Vatican II ushered in a new era of dialogue and engagement, embracing the idea of the church in the world, meaning that the church needed to actively participate in and shape contemporary culture rather than just rejecting it outright.
That's a pretty big change in thinking.
It was. And this new approach is reflected in key documents, like Gaudium et Spes, which stresses the importance of understanding and engaging with contemporary culture, including its art, literature, and ideas.
It sounds like this new approach to culture would require a whole reevaluation of how the church thought about censorship. Did Vatican II specifically address the role of art and literature?
It did. The council actually acknowledged the value of artistic expression in exploring human experiences and advocated for artistic freedom and even for church support of the arts. Quite a departure from the days of banning books and censoring films, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. So what happened to all those banned books? Was the index of forbidden books just quietly shelved?
You could say that. It wasn't officially abolished until 1966, but its influence had definitely waned considerably by that point.
It seems like with Vatican II, the church really moved from a defensive posture towards culture to one of dialogue and engagement. But wouldn't some argue that despite these good intentions, this openness might lead to a weakening of the church's core values and teachings?
That was definitely a concern for some within the church. But Vatican II also emphasized the importance of individual conscience and religious freedom, particularly in the document Dignitatis Humanae. This focus on a well-formed conscience, empowered by education and critical thinking, makes external censorship less necessary.
So instead of telling people what they could and couldn't read, they were equipping them to make their own informed choices.
Exactly. The idea was that individuals equipped with a strong moral compass could navigate the complexities of the modern world without needing the church to act as a constant censor.
That makes sense. But it makes me wonder how this approach plays out in practice. With outward censorship methods mostly abandoned, how does the church respond to expressions it finds objectionable in art, literature, or even in the media?
That's a great question, and one we'll explore further in the next part of our deep dive. We'll see that while outright censorship may be a thing of the past, the conversation around what's considered acceptable and who gets to decide is far from over.
So, if they're not like outright censoring things, how does the church respond to things they find objectionable?
Well, they've shifted more towards a model of what you might call moral suasion and dialogue. So instead of banning books or pressuring filmmakers, it's more about engaging in conversation and offering critique.
So who's doing the talking here? Is it still like top-down pronouncements from the Vatican?
Not always. Hagstrom actually points to William A. Donahue and the Catholic League as a kind of interesting example.
A Catholic League.
Yeah, the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights. They act like a sort of watchdog group, keeping an eye out for things they see as anti-Catholic.
And then what? Do they like issue condemnations?
Not exactly. It's more about responding through public critique and debate. So they're calling out what they see as offensive, but not necessarily trying to, shut down the conversation entirely.
Okay, so give me an example of this in action.
Well, there was this controversial play called Corpus Christi that a lot of Catholics found, blasphemous. Donahue actually opposed any kind of legal action against the university that was staging the play.
Really? Why?
Because he felt that open criticism was just a better approach than censorship.
Interesting. So it seems like they're more willing to engage in the marketplace of ideas rather than trying to control it.
It's a definite shift.
But what about that in-house censorship we talked about earlier? Has that gone away completely?
Yeah, I was wondering about that too.
Well, not entirely. The concern for those who might be more susceptible to potentially harmful or, misleading ideas is still there.
Right. The simple pious faithful, as Hagstrom calls them.
Exactly. So how does this in-house censorship manifest itself today?
Yeah, is it still about maintaining those strict doctrinal boundaries within the church community?
In some ways, yes. One example would be the censure of theologians whose views are deemed incompatible with church doctrine. Oh, right, like those theologians who get in trouble for questioning certain teachings.
Yeah, Hagstrom mentions Leonardo Boff and Charles Curran. Both of them face sanctions for their theological writings.
But wouldn't some argue that this kind of stifles theological debate and, prevents the church from evolving with the times?
It's a valid point for sure. There's always going to be that tension between preserving tradition and allowing for new interpretations.
And it's not just about censuring theologians, is it? There are other ways the church exerts control over what's considered acceptable within the community.
Right. Another example would be the requirement of imprimatur or nihil obstat on certain religious texts.
Imprimatur nihil obstat, those sound like spells from Harry Potter. What do they actually mean?
They're basically declarations of approval from church authorities. Imprimatur means let it be printed, and nihil obstat means nothing stands in the way.
So it's like a stamp of approval from the church.
Exactly. It means the text has been reviewed and is considered free from doctrinal error.
So if I'm reading a book on Catholic theology and I see those terms on the copyright page,
it's a signal that the book aligns with official church teaching.
It's interesting how all this connects back to those New Testament passages about avoiding false teachers and maintaining sound doctrine. It seems like even with a more open approach to culture in general, the church still sees a role for itself in safeguarding the integrity of its teachings.
Absolutely. Especially for those who might be more vulnerable to misinterpretations.
Okay, so that makes sense for the church. But now I'm curious about censorship outside the church. We live in a society that supposedly values free speech. Does censorship even exist in America?
That's a great question, and one that Hagstrom tackles head on. She argues that despite the First Amendment, censorship in America does exist. It just often takes on more subtle forms.
I have a feeling you're going to bring up those movie ratings again.
Well, they are a prime example. Think about it. The GPG,
Describe.
PG-13, or NC-17 system, it's a form of censorship, even if it's based on content deemed appropriate for different age groups. It still limits access to certain films based on those predetermined standards.
I guess that's true. But some might argue that it's more about parental guidance than government control.
Right. And we see similar things with content warnings on TV.
Oh, yeah, those little TV14, TVMA ratings that pop up all the time.
Exactly. They serve a similar purpose, flagging potentially sensitive material for viewers. And it goes beyond ratings, too. Broadcasters often self-censor, meaning they choose not to air certain things to avoid controversy or legal issues.
It makes you wonder what kind of stuff we're not seeing because of that self-censorship.
Right. And it's not just limited to visual media either. Hagstrom also brings up those heated debates surrounding book banning, especially in school libraries.
Oh, yeah, those debates can get pretty intense. What about the news media? Do they ever engage in self-censorship?
More often than you might think. Remember after 9/11 how some news outlets chose not to air Osama bin Laden's videos?
Oh, yeah, they were worried about those coded messages.
Exactly. And some networks stopped showing footage of the planes hitting the World Trade Center, even though that footage was widely available.
It seems like even in a society that values free speech, there are still these lines that people are hesitant to cross.
For sure. And it's not just media outlets. Hagstrom also discusses the debates surrounding funding for the arts. Specifically, the National Endowment for the Arts, or NEA.
Ah, the NEA. It seems like every few years they become a political football.
They do. And what gets funded and what doesn't often reflects societal values and can be seen as a form of censorship, even if it's not outright banning.
So it's like saying, we'll tolerate your expression, but we're not going to support it financially.
Exactly. It makes you wonder if something isn't deemed worthy of funding, is it truly considered free expression?
It's a good question, and it leads us to another form of censorship that's very prevalent today, political correctness.
Ah, yes, political correctness. It's a very modern form of censorship, wouldn't you say?
It feels like there's this unspoken list of acceptable opinions, and if you stray too far from that list, you risk being ostracized or even professionally penalized.
That's a key point that Hagstrom explores. While the PC movement, as it's often called, can be well-intentioned, it can also lead to the silencing of dissenting voices, even in academia, where open inquiry is supposed to be so important.
But wouldn't some argue that political correctness is just about promoting tolerance and respect for marginalized groups?
Of course, but it can also create a chilling effect on free speech.
Yeah.
People may self-censor, avoiding certain topics or expressions for fear of being labeled offensive or insensitive, even if their intentions are good.
So it's kind of like a form of indirect censorship, where social pressure rather than government decree dictates what can and cannot be said. Do you think this self-censorship, this fear of causing offense, is ultimately beneficial or harmful to society?
It's a tough question with no easy answer. It's a tension we're still grappling with today, and one that we'll explore further as we continue our deep dive into the world of censorship.
Wow, it feels like we've just scratched the surface here. We've gone from ancient Rome to modern-day America, from the Catholic Church to political correctness. It seems like censorship just takes on so many forms.
It really does, and it pops up in the most unexpected places.
It makes you wonder, is any form of censorship ever really justified?
That's the question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. It always comes down to this balancing act between protecting individuals or communities from harm and upholding the principles of free expression.
It's like those examples we talked about earlier, the Taliban destroying those ancient Buddha statues or the protests in Tiananmen Square. Those seem pretty clear-cut, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to defend those actions as anything other than attempts to suppress dissenting views.
But even in those cases, you have to consider the context.
Right. The Taliban, for example, they saw those statues as idolatrous and a direct threat to their religious beliefs. So while we may strongly disagree with their actions, understanding their motivations can help us see how censorship often comes from those deeply held values and beliefs.
It reminds me of that Voltaire quote, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it."
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between protecting people from harm and respecting their right to express themselves, even when those expressions are offensive or controversial.
But who gets to decide what constitutes harm?
That's the tricky part. That line can be so subjective, and it changes over time and across cultures. What might be deeply offensive in one context could be perfectly acceptable in another.
It makes you wonder what future generations will think of our current attempts at censorship.
Right. Well, they look back at our concerns about hate speech or offensive content and think we were totally misguided.
What seems reasonable to us today might seem completely ridiculous 100 years from now.
It's definitely possible. And it just highlights how important it is to constantly reevaluate our assumptions and be open to different perspectives.
Think about the index of forbidden books. It once held so much power, but now it seems almost quaint.
It's a good example of how our understanding of what needs to be censored changes over time.
It makes you wonder if any form of censorship can really stand the test of time.
It's a valid question.
Yeah.
But I think the bigger question is, how do we as individuals navigate this complex landscape of censorship in a way that both upholds freedom and recognizes our responsibility to others?
It's a tough one.
It is. But I think it starts with acknowledging that censorship in all its forms is a powerful tool that should be used very carefully.
We need to be aware of its potential for both good and bad.
Exactly. It can be used to protect the vulnerable, but it can also be used to silence dissent and maintain power.
And we need to be willing to have those difficult conversations about where the line should be drawn.
It's not about finding easy answers. It's about wrestling with these complex questions together.
It seems like the more we understand the history of censorship, the more we realize how relevant it is to our own lives.
It's not just about some abstract debate. It's about how we engage with the world around us, how we form our own opinions, and how we interact with those who hold different views.
So here's a final thought to leave our listeners with. Where do you draw the line between protecting individuals and respecting freedom of expression?
It's a question worth thinking about in every aspect of our lives. From the books we read to the conversations we have online, to the choices we make about what we consume and what we create.
It's a conversation worth continuing both with ourselves and with others.
After all, the freedom to think critically and engage in open dialogue is one of the most precious freedoms we have.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of censorship. We hope it's given you some food for thought.
Definitely. Until next time.